SilverStone's ML10 or Milo chassis is a mini-itx box that costs a penny under £50 here in the UK. You need a power supply, I'll come to that. Power supply costs more than the chassis, and it has a great many options for configuration. So many in fact that Silverstone supplies a table which gives you 5 different choices of CPU cooler height. So depending whether you go for this high front and tall top panel, or switch out this low profile front and low profile top cover, depending on whether you're going high profile or low profile and what size cooler you have, dictates whether you're limited to M.2 storage on your motherboard, or potentially go the other route and you can squeeze a 3.5-inch hard drive inside this tiny chassis. Before I dive inside the Milo 10, are you subscribed to KitGuruTech? If you're not, please consider doing so, because that would please me mightily. With the low profile front, the case is 2.7 litres in capacity, as it is now 3.6 litres, so either way it's bloomin' small. 2 screws at the rear, off with the top panel. That reveals the optical drive bay. We're talking laptop optical drive, of course. That's not something I've seen in a long time. But if you really want a laptop optical drive inside your PC, there is a little blank there you can pop loose. And then once we're inside, let's pull out these 2 screws. And a different screw on the bottom. Feed these cables out from the front buttons, so that's the power button there, and there's a hard drive or power activity light there, and here we have a couple of USB 3s, and there we have the chassis. Take off this drive plate, 4 screws, and as you can see, truly tiny. Motherboard goes in there, 4 standoffs are ITX. You can, if you choose, install up to 3 40mm fans along the side, up to 10mm in thickness, which essentially will hide inside that overhang there. The business with cooler installation, obviously it depends whether you're going AMD or Intel, but let us take a stock Intel low profile aluminium, hasn't even got the copper center cooler that you get with a modern Core i5. And look at that, just resting on the floor of the case. Look at that. Turns out they're a lot bigger than you thought. If you choose, you can install a really low profile Silverstone cooler. Look at the difference. It's just remarkable. There's low profile and there's really low profile. So that's the guts of the chassis. I think it's time to put a few bits of hardware inside and just show exactly how those look. I've gone for an enthusiast motherboard, this Gigabyte Z590i Aorus Ultra, obviously mini-itx, and clearly Z590 means the latest chipset. Processor is this utterly feeble 10th gen Intel Core i3, because I just want to get a system up and running and see how it behaves. And the other reason for choosing an i3 is that the CPU cooler is this incredibly low profile Silverstone NT07-115X. Nonetheless, the cooler is rated at 65 watts. Storage. We take the drive plate, we install these 4 standoffs which are included in the accessory kit. We get the plate the correct way around. It has a back marking, which is this end, and low. We have a 3.5-inch hard drive inside this diddly little chassis. Put a couple of the screws in place to hold the bracket down. Okay, and with the standoffs, we are required to use the tall top cover. And there you go, Intel Core i3, Z590 motherboard, M.2 storage, 3.5-inch hard drive. But you may have no interest in a hulking great big 3.5-inch hard drive. Indeed, you might think that it's not the greatest idea in the world to have a 3.5-inch hard drive directly above your CPU cooler. In which case you might fancy some 2.5-inch SATA SSDs. Out with the hard drive, take 2 SSDs, install them on the bracket, and there we go. A couple of screws. And you can see that we now have a reasonable amount of clearance between the SSDs and that incredibly low profile cooler. Clearly, taller cooler, less clearance, that's obvious. And there we have it, 1 or 2 M.2 SSDs on an Enthusiast motherboard, 2 2.5-inch SATA SSDs, that's 10 terabytes potentially of storage. I mean, some crazy number. I'm not suggesting you put that in this system, but it is feasible. Despite its tiny size, Milo 10 has no limit on storage capacity. How, you might wonder, do you power the PC that you built inside your Milo 10 chassis? Very good question, and the answer lies in this, and this, and also this. So what you have is a 120 watt power brick that sits outside the chassis, just as with a laptop, and then inside the chassis you have to use this, which is a DC-DC power converter. And that means that the juice from this looks all familiar and PC-like. And we've also got some SATA connections in case you want to use the storage. And there we have Molex, and here we have EPS, because obviously a motherboard needs both 24-pin and 8-pin EPS. As you can see, I was sent an early non-retail version of this power supply because they're in short supply at the moment. It's worth pointing out at £72 it looks relatively expensive. You can find much cheaper Pico power supply units on Amazon. You need to be cautious if you're going down that route to establish whether the Pico part comes with the external power brick or not, what the power rating is, and what the quality is as well. Proceed as you see fit, but I say proceed with caution. We have to put this hardware in the chassis and then we can run the system. So we have to feed cables through here. I don't need these, which is quite vexing, but they're all attached, so feed those through as well. And this, which is where the power brick connects, feeds through to the back of the chassis. And then we secure the DC-DC converter to the standoffs at the front panel. And we cover the whole shooting match with the plastic front cover. That's the power board installed. And you can see the inside is looking slightly full. And then we take the front cover, feed the cables through these holes at the side, find the headers for the front panel connections for the button and for the LED, and we attach the USB front header. And there we go, a finished PC. Slide on the top cover, connect up peripherals, monitor and such like, we're good to go. And of course you've spotted the two glaring flaws. The one is we're limited to 65 watts of CPU cooler, and therefore by definition a low power processor. The other is no graphics. We're using integrated graphics. Yikes. Let us briefly give some thought to which processor would go inside the Milo 10. It needs to be sub 65 watts or something you can restrict to 65 watts at the very least, and it needs to have integrated graphics. So AMD Ryzen out of the picture, as are these older AMD Ryzens. I do have the option of an AMD APU, such as this Ryzen 5 2400G. I discussed this with Luke in that video we did a week ago, and you can't buy it any longer. It was superseded by the 3000 parts, which are also no longer available. They've all sold out. And the newer APUs, the 4000s and 5000s, AMD won't sell them to the public. They are for system integrators only. You know, the likes of Lenovo and such like, and HP and so on. So we can't buy an AMD APU. So unless you happen to have an old APU, AMD's off the table. Intel i9 and i7 9000 series, their K SKUs way more than 65 watts, so they're no good. Obviously high-end desktops no good, Threadripper clearly. What have we got here? This is of interest. That's an i9 which draws a thick end of 300 watts under extreme load, certainly 200, no good whatsoever. Core i5 11400F, that's nice and low powered. But an F, that means it doesn't have graphics, discrete graphics required. No good. Of interest to me, however, is that the 11400 has this rather swoopy looking black heatsink, which in turn has a copper core to it. So a nice low profile cooler for the 11400F. If it wasn't the F SKU, that might be worth considering. Core i5 10600, 65 watts. That's absolutely on the limits. That's something you might want to consider. All these 11th gen processors are sent for review. 11700F, no good. 10600K, that's way past 65 watts. And 10700KF, F, no graphics. I think we can say Rocket Lake Core i9 is also off the table. So we've got a Core i3 10300, which is what is currently installed inside the Milo 10. Or potentially this previous gen Core i5 10600. I've got loads of processors, I've got very little choice. No doubt you're wondering why the emphasis on the tiny chassis, and here's the explanation. If you have an office with tiny little desks and you don't want all the PC clutter, then you mount your tiny PC on the back of a suitable monitor. I've got about half a dozen monitors. This is the oldest by a long chalk, it dates back to 2009. And on the back it has this Visa pattern mounting holes. The other monitors, the stands all attach in that position. That allows you to tilt and pivot and such like. So you take the supplied mount, screw it on like so, attach two supplied screws and rubber washers to the casing, and then you'd need to set the tension on the screws just so. That could be quite an appealing setup for a hotel reception desk or a small office, but it's not the sort of thing that enthusiasts are generally fussed about. Nonetheless, the mounts are included in the package from SilverStone. Just for a giggle, we're going to run a quick benchmark. So, a quad-core Core i3 with integrated UHD graphics 630. You don't see this on KitGuru very often, so let's see how we get on with Firestrike. If I'm entirely frank, I do not hold out high hopes. It's kind of what I expected, but it's still disappointing to see. Let's leave it running, see if we get a score at the end. Well, I'm creeping towards the view that this might not be the ideal setup for a gamer. Oh, what? 1290? Oof. I think we should add some decent graphics to the Milo 10 by referring to Dominic's recent video, which featured this very CoolerMaster EG200.
The dock in question today is CoolerMaster's EG200, a brand new and pretty compact external enclosure. Considering it does use Thunderbolt 3, which will give us 4 lanes of PCIe Gen 3, that is the same as the vast majority of external GPU enclosures on the market.
So it connects over Thunderbolt 3 and it supports a proper graphics card, such as this Gigabyte RTX 2080 Super. That should give the little system a boost, I think. However, I need Thunderbolt 3 to connect to the back of the CoolerMaster, and the Gigabyte board does not have Thunderbolt 3. So if I swap over to this Asus ROG Strix Z590i gaming Wi-Fi motherboard, which does have Thunderbolt 3, and while I'm at it, let's boost the processor up to a Core i5 11600K, I think that would make things interesting. And at the same time, I'm going to add a cooling fan to the inside of the Milo 10's lid, because it does in fact support a 120 or a 140 fan. So I can indeed put this whacking great big Noctua fan inside the chassis. Realistically, I'm going to have to limit the power in the motherboard BIOS for the Core i5. I'll go to 65 watts just to play nice with the system. That is, after all, the maximum rating of the CPU cooler. but I'm quite sure it's going to appreciate the extra assistance from the Noctua. So motherboard swap, processor swap, extra cooling, and then we can plug in the external graphics and see whether or not it can deliver some grunt. Well, there we go. This is the Kit Guru approach. Change the motherboard, change the processor, add a load of cooling, crank up the cooling, add in an external graphics unit, and now you can run Firestrike. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's quite fun, isn't it? Conclusive proof that an RTX 2080 Super beats the bejesus out of Intel integrated graphics. Science has been done by Kit Guru once again. When SilverStone first briefed me about the Milo 10 from memory last June for their virtual Computex, I was intrigued. I was being briefed on a whole range of different products and I wasn't quite aware how small Milo 10 is. And then it arrived and I thought, what on earth am I going to do with this? Because of course it requires an APU, and AMD refuses to sell us APUs, which is just frustrating as anything. So you're limited to Intel processors. Among enthusiasts, Intel at the moment is a bit of a bad smell. There are certain Intel processors that may well deserve a place inside this system, but you have to pick and choose very carefully. So that's problematic, and the fact 65 watts or less, I mean, that's definitely a limiting thing. So you have to have a reason for wanting a tiddly little PC, and then you have to pick the hardware to go inside that PC. And that's two problems that come together to create, for some people, a solution. For most people, a what the heck is this all about moment. Taken in its own terms, however, Milo 10, the chassis itself is very cheap, no argument. With the power supply, you're up to £120. So that's reasonably expensive, but then by the time you've taken any case and power supply combo, you're looking at some fairly serious money, particularly right now with a big shortage where you've got so little choice with anything. So the obvious question to you is, do you want a really tiny chassis for an integrated system? And I'm going to guess for most of you the answer is no, not in the slightest. And that's the case for me as well, I hasten to add. But if you do, then there's this. And once you've decided this might be a thing for you, so pricing is perfectly reasonable, the quality is absolutely fine, the options of the high and low covers and the different front panels is quite neat. The solutions for storage are truly surprising to me. The idea you can get a 3.5-inch hard drive in there or two SATA SSDs, plus of course M.2s. Well, wow, that might not be of any interest to you because you might be running an external storage system, in which case that's an irrelevance as well, but it is possible. The option of instead putting a fan in the roof of the case, that's interesting. Full ITX, okay, that goes back to pricing however, because ITX tends to be expensive. Wrap it all together and it's more of a conundrum than a solution for me. I'm certain that some of you are going to go, yep, that's exactly what I've been looking for. I've been waiting months for this thing to arrive because it's well overdue because of the DC-DC power converter. That's taken 6 months to arrive. It was due last September. So now we've got all the pieces together. We're good to go. So in its own terms, the Milo 10 delivers. However, for the vast majority of PC enthusiasts, it's just a bizarre oddity. Which is why, quite frankly, this review has been rather lengthy, far more lengthy than, say, my Fantex P200 review, because it is so unusual. I wanted to show the different angles of it. So I'm going to take this PC apart, I'm going to put it to one side, and I'm never going to touch the Milo 10 chassis ever again.